Peter says, we were eyewitnesses. And then he says, we heard for ourselves the voice that came from the cloud. We heard it and we saw it. Peter, James, and John heard it and saw it on that day of the Transfiguration. Jesus made it clear to them. Light, voice. He manifested himself yet again as God, as the one that all must listen to. Our faith is based on historical fact and on a God who does not keep himself hidden. He manifests himself. He engages not just our mind and heart, not just the soul and the virtues and the spirit. God made us human, and so he engages us in our humanity, in our senses. He wants to touch us in every way. And so the Transfiguration becomes another one of those moments where we remember the visibility of God and the humanity of the way in which he communicates with us. This was essential for the apostles, those who were there and then those who would hear about it later. It was essential for them because Jesus was preparing them for the days of the Passion. Moses and Elijah were talking to him. Moses representing the law that had prepared for and pointed to Christ for centuries prior. And Elijah, of course, represented the prophets, who also prepared for and pointed to the coming Christ. And what were they talking to him about? They weren't talking to him about the glory that was being manifested at that moment. They were talking to him about the darkness. They weren't talking to him about the light. They were talking to him about the passion that he would endure, the scriptures tell us. Because they had spoken about it already. In the law, it was prefigured. The slaying of the Paschal Lamb. It was foretold. In the prophets, it was foretold. You think of the servant songs of the prophet Isaiah, for example. The fourth of which, the most powerful, is read on Good Friday. Many dogs have surrounded me. A band of the wicked beset me. They tear holes in my hands and my feet. I can count every one of my bones. He was a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. Moses and Elijah knew of the coming sufferings of Christ. The law and the prophets foretold them. And they knew of the coming glory. God would highly exalt his suffering servant. Archbishop Sheen preached about the law of withdrawal and return. We have to withdraw, have solitude with Christ, and see and remind ourselves of the evidence of his glory. We need the Transfiguration. We have to withdraw regularly and encounter the glory of God, encounter the spiritual strength that he gives us, meditate on his word, worship him in the Eucharist. We have to withdraw, but it's the law of withdrawal and return. He took them up on the mountain, and then he brought them down from the mountain. 'Tis good, Lord, to be here. Let's set up 3 booths. Let's live here. Wouldn't that be awesome? And if they lived there, if they stayed there, if God could grant their request and push a pause button at that moment, they could listen to Moses and Elijah conversing with him for who knows how long. But he had them come down because he had to actually do what Moses and Elijah were foretelling, that is, endure the passion, and this would be hard for the disciples. This would be incredibly hard for those apostles. On Good Friday, only John was left standing there. Peter himself, who saw the transfiguration, denied him. When they said, you were with this man, I can tell by your accent, you are one of his followers too. He said, I don't even know what you're talking about. But of course he knew what they were talking about. He saw the transfiguration. It takes an awful lot to prepare us for the darkness. Even with this, they fled. Even with this. You can have people who have the highest spiritual experiences ending up fleeing the scene when danger and trouble come. They flee the scene. It will always be a very small number who stay by the cross. But the Lord gives us these opportunities to see the evidence. To see the evidence of his kingship, like Daniel saw in this marvelous dream that he had. What a marvelous vision. Wheels of burning fire, and the court is opened, and the books are opened, and the Son of Man appears. And so we're given the evidence too. We have even more than they did. We have even more than Daniel had. We have even more than Peter, James, and John had. Because we have now the fullness of the gospel, the fullness of the church, the sacraments. We have all the visible evidence. And we who are serving the unborn have a chance to present that evidence to the public of the reality of the glory of God shown in their lives, in the sacredness of human life, and also the evidence of the reality of abortion. And it's constantly this dialogue, if you will, between seeing the evidence, strengthening ourselves because we see the evidence, and then going out and proclaiming it to the world. But then we have to come back and look at the evidence again. Look again at the message that we're proclaiming. See again the reason we're proclaiming it. In solitude, looking at it. And then going back out and proclaiming it amidst a world that's contradicting it at every turn. Amidst a world where, even though you've seen the evidence, they'll make you think that you're the one that doesn't know what he's talking about. They haven't seen the evidence. The ones who crucified Jesus, they hadn't seen his glory. So those apostles really had to be strong in the conviction. No, the one you're crucifying here, he's guiding the stars in their courses. He's going to judge you at the end of time. He's going to raise you from the dead, and then he's going to separate the sheep from the goats, and some are going to go to heaven, and some are going to go to hell. That's the one you're crucifying right now. But what does it take to be convinced of that? I don't mean convinced of it theoretically. I mean being convinced of it when you're standing at the cross and the blood is flowing to the ground. What does it take to be convinced about the sanctity of the unborn and the urgency of abolishing abortion when you're in the midst of people who are saying, you're the deceptive ones. You're the evildoers. Oh, not us. We at Planned Parenthood, we provide wonderful health services. Millions of people depend upon us. Oh my goodness, if we were to be closed down, the whole nation would collapse, never mind the rest of the world too. The stars would stop in their courses if we didn't get our money. And by the way, you people are the deceptive ones. Peter said, we have seen it for ourselves, and we have heard with our own ears his voice. And brothers and sisters, so have we. And because we've heard Christ's voice, and we've touched his flesh, as we will again hear in the Eucharist, and because we've seen and heard and touched and felt the reality of abortion, which we deal with every day, and which we have to constantly go back to. As I often say to people, one of the things I do when they ask me, well, how do you keep going in this particular mission? And I say, well, one of the things I do is I, by myself, will sit down in front of my computer and look again at the graphic images of the victims of abortion. Now, don't I know what they look like? Yeah, but that's not the point. That's not the point of telling someone something they don't know. It's the law of withdrawal and return. It's going again and again and again to the source, to the foundation, to the center, to the reason why then we go out and do a mission that engages so much of our energy. Right now, America is being given a look at the evidence more than most people have ever seen. And so it brings us to a crossroads. Because now one of two things begins to happen in the hearts and minds of our fellow citizens, including our elected officials. One of the things that can begin to happen is that the moral and emotional outrage, the psychological impact of seeing aborted babies and of seeing the grisly practice of selling their body parts, that outrage can lead to action. It can. It can wake people up and say, okay, I have to do something about this. And it can actually lead them to do something, including our elected officials. It can actually lead them to take action, to end these atrocities. That's one possible result. But the fork in the road is that besides outrage leading to action, the other possibility is that outrage can then be drowned by excuses. Oh yes, I'm outraged, no doubt about it. I've just seen something, I can't unsee it. And then the one who has seen it invents an excuse not to take action. Now if you do that once, then you have to create another excuse to explain to yourself why you did that. How is it possible that you saw human beings torn apart and thrown into a dish, and you didn't do something about it? You didn't say something about it. You didn't take action that you could take to stop it. Oh, well, the reason I didn't is because, fill in the blank. You make an excuse for yourself. But if you make one excuse for yourself, then you've got to go back and make a second one, because you've got to explain to yourself, and others, by the way, why you didn't take action. And you have to take a third excuse and a fourth. And after a while, you build up layer upon layer of excuses and rationalizations. And what happens? That voice of protest that arises when people first see the evil, the voice of protest that arises within us, gets drowned out. And you don't hear it anymore. And you go back to life, business as usual. There is where we stand right now, at that crossroads. Will the voice of protest lead to action, or will it be drowned out in excuses? The reason for the transfiguration was that these apostles needed to go back. They needed to see that evidence. They needed to be strengthened, because there would be this onslaught of darkness that could cause people to think, maybe this isn't the Son of God. If you are the Son of God, come down from that cross here and now, so that we may believe in you. Those who said that, they wanted the evidence at that moment. And God said, no. I gave you the evidence at the transfiguration. Now it's time for faith. Now it's time for remembering. Now it's time for the voice that came inside of you, that voice of utter astonishment, that voice crying out inside of you when you saw the glory and you saw the cloud and you saw the vision and you saw Moses and Elijah, you see Peter, James, and John. There was a voice that rose up inside of them. And it was a voice that said, I've got to proclaim this to the world. This is the Son of God. This is the one everybody has to listen to. I've got to go out there and I've got to tell the world. See, that's the other reason why they couldn't stay on the mountain. It wasn't only because, well, life is not always about the glory, it's about the suffering. It was because they ought to be running down that mountain. Running down to go out to tell the world what they just saw. And Jesus said to them, there will be a time to tell it too, after I rise from the dead. Then you tell the whole story. But you see the point. And so Peter, in conclusion here, says at the end of that passage that we read, it's a little bit surprising because he said, look, keep your eyes on the evidence. Keep your eyes on the evidence because it's dark out there. But keep your eyes on it because what's going to happen, he says, be attentive to it, he says, as a lamp shining in a dark place. Those who have faith in Christ, it's a lamp shining in a dark place, a world full of doubt and false religions. Keep the eye on the lamp in a dark place, the evidence of who the unborn are and what abortion is, in a world filled with denial and distortion. But keep your eye on the lamp. Why? Because the day is going to dawn. It's night. The lamp is shining. But the sun is getting ready to rise. And so Peter says, keep your eye on it as a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises. Now you would expect, following the flow of the thoughts here in the reading, that it would stop there. The analogy is unfolding pretty nicely. It's dark outside, the lamp is there, it's shining, your eyes are on it, the morning star is rising, the dawn is coming, and the day begins. But then he adds an interesting twist, doesn't he? He says, keep your eye on the lamp in the dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises. So right now you're looking at the horizon, you're seeing the sun come up, but then he says it rises in your hearts. Now all of a sudden, this last minute changing of the whole analogy. It's no longer the sun arising on the horizon and the day lighting up. Now all of a sudden he's talking about inside here. He says the morning star rises in your hearts. Because the transfiguration is meant for salvation. And the evidence we present to the world about abortion is meant not only to save those lives, it too is meant for salvation. The people of God, seeing the evil of abortion, must repent. And if they don't, not only will those lives not be saved, they will not be saved. The morning star doesn't just rise on the horizon, it rises in our hearts. If we don't respond, if we don't let the voice of protest turn into action to end the violence we're protesting, well, if instead it gets covered with excuses and rationalizations, we end up in hell. The choice to save them is the decision to save ourselves. More accurately, to let the one of whom the Father said, "This is my beloved Son," listen to him, to allow him to save us, and to allow him to bring us to the life that never will end. Amen.